This is what happens when you give one man more power than entire nations combined. If Bill Gates was a country, he would top some 158 nations in the world. And what is he doing with all his wealth? Well, he's giving it away, of course.
This is philanthropy.
Bill Gates is the most generous billionaire, a selfless idol, a saint even. It is almost as if Gates was physically incapable of doing anything wrong.
I had dinners with him. I regret doing that.
Nothing good exists without a condition. Gates and his foundation have been celebrated for endeavors in poverty and healthcare around the world. But when you analyze the publicly available grant database, you'll see that in the last 2 decades, the Gates Foundation dedicated more than $10 billion to education agenda in the United States. According to Bill Gates, this number is so insignificant next to the enormous education budget.
K-12 education is 600 billion years of money.
It's just a rounding error.
Our advocacy money is a rounding error.
But the real story isn't in the amount of money. It is in how Gates' connections and wealth were able to dictate the fate of trillions of taxpayers' money that followed his investments. With just $10 billion, Gates became the main architect of US public school policy, bankrolling research, deployment, and lobbying campaigns that pushed for a reform after reform according to the whims of the world's most influential elite. This is how, and also why, it happened. When Bill Gates founded his charity, education was high among its priorities. In his very first attempt, Gates thought the real problem of poor education is when schools were too big. According to some scarce evidence, smaller schools performed better than large institutions, at least for the merits that Bill Gates deemed important. So the Gates Foundation invested $650 million in pre-Great Recession dollars and began breaking up schools into smaller units with lower student-to-teacher ratio. The goal was to improve student achievement, which, according to the Gateses, was when the rates of college-ready graduates significantly increased. But that had to happen without increases in operational cost per student. Efficiency was a key metric for a former Microsoft CEO. What a surprise. But Gates' efforts went contrary to the well-established and experience-based approach that large schools are more efficient at delivering quality education at a low cost per student. Nonetheless, year after year, the Gates Foundation kept pouring more money and resources to make this project work, and they couldn't. 9 years into the initiative, small schools didn't see any improvement in student performance nor efficiency. Students in smaller schools didn't achieve better results than their peers in larger schools. In some cases, they scored even worse. All the while, the cost per student increased, and the total budget the foundation ended up spending ballooned into $2 billion. This was a precious moment for Bill Gates to pause for a bit, reflect on himself, and take the L. But instead of admitting to failure of its own pet project, Gates took to blame teachers, education standards, and the curriculum, because of course. And he was ready to go thermonuclear on this. In the summer of 2008, when the Gateses were already aware their small school initiative was a failure, the ultra-wealthy couple had a secret meeting. In their Seattle headquarters, they sat down with Gene Wilhoit and David Coleman, 2 advocates for a national education policy called Common Core. So what was this about? Just look at what they viewed as the biggest problem of the current education system. They saw it in the teaching standards. More specifically, in how the standards varied between states, districts, and sometimes even schools. The extent of this fragmentation, at least that's what they argued, led to an unequal access to educational materials and teaching excellence. And in their view, it rendered high school diplomas useless. So they came up with Common Core, this new set of standards that was proposed to unify what merits schools should prioritize. In their idea, it was supposed to be reading and math. English classes should emphasize nonfiction, and students must use evidence to back up their claims. In math, students should demonstrate the ability to solve problems in multiple ways and provide explanation of how they found their answers. The standards would be managed from the top rather than leaving it to schools and states. To ensure the success of Common Core, the new standards would be accompanied by a considerable data mining operation. Detailed information on everything that happens in the classroom, from student behavior through grades to reports on mental health, should be collected and analyzed. And for now, let's just not worry about consent from parents while doing that, okay? The Gateses were sold. And not just a little bit, they went all in. Right off the bat, the Gates Foundation dedicated $233 million to bankroll research, development, and implementation of the Common Core standards. The Gates lobbying machine got to work and began pouring additional millions into political campaigns across the spectrum, convincing state and federal educational authorities, districts, and schools to begin adoption as quickly as possible. Political groups that wouldn't talk to each other on virtually any other issue suddenly found themselves allied on the educational front. In the most Machiavellian way, the newly appointed Obama administration was stuffed with former staffers and associates of the Gates Foundation. They lobbied extensively to make the federal government use its levers to push for the new educational agenda on the state level. And so the president dangled federal funds over states to coerce them into accepting Common Core.
We set aside over $4 billion to promote improvements in schools. And rather than divvying it up and handing it out, we are letting states and school districts compete for it.
What followed was one of the most dramatic policy changes in the history of the United States. In 2 short years since the Seattle meeting, without a single vote taken by an elected representative, 45 states and DC fully adopted the Common Core state standards. What one billionaire thought should be the merit of achievement now de facto took the force of a national curriculum.
We'll only know if this effort has succeeded when the curriculum and tests are aligned to these standards.
Even though neither Gates nor Obama's children attended schools that use Common Core, the standards were adopted so quickly there was little to any public debate and virtually no criticism. But as time passed, some began noticing problems.
Reports of students refusing to take the tests are coming in daily.
We already had the SATs, the ACTs. We have to have a certain grade point average to even get into college, and we don't need another hindrance.
And those problems led to opposition.
And last month, Seattle school teachers took that protest a step further, walking off their jobs for the first time in 30 years.
Oklahoma became the latest state to take a big step toward repealing national so-called Common Core education standards.
At first, the criticism was mostly coming from the conservative wing of the political spectrum.
When it comes to perhaps social issues, we may not agree, but on this issue, we are shoulder to shoulder.
Mainly as part of the broader opposition to the Obama administration.
Most Republican presidential candidates condemn the Common Core standards as government overreach.
But in a few years, that criticism spilled over to old political circles.
While liberals like Hagopian say they promote inequality.
Experts and authorities were looking for evidence of improvement, but they didn't get it. In spite of the high expectations, no evidence that Common Core standards boosted graduation rates or student achievement was found.
Take New York. Legislators there are calling for a 2-year moratorium on the core after student test scores tanked.
Teachers' unions, they came in, and while initially supportive, they slowly began realizing that the standards are just market-based education reform.
It's become a multi-billion-dollar industry to sell exams to children in order to rank and sort them.
Privacy advocates raised concerns about data collection practices. Troves of sensitive information on students was being collected without parental consent. Data mining companies boasted they had more information on students than Google, by far. One private surveillance program bankrolled and lobbied for by Gates himself was forced to shut down due to its violations of children's privacy. Then, critics began to question Bill Gates' true motives. As part of the Common Core reform, schools had to open up to digitalization of classrooms and teaching. Skeptics argued that Microsoft, as one of the software developers, stood to benefit from such an embrace of technology and emphasis on data. Gates vehemently rejected notions that his efforts were motivated by self-interest.
Do you seriously think that the reason I like the Common Core is for some self-interested reason? That's what you're saying.
But in February of 2014, Microsoft announced a joint collaboration with Pearson, the world's largest educational publisher. They launched a brand new set of materials for Common Core that was platformed on the Microsoft Surface tablet. This deal would open up the doors to an unrestrained access to student data for the Microsoft Corporation, where at that time, Bill Gates was the largest individual shareholder and wouldn't leave the board until 2020. Whether Bill Gates was motivated by personal gain or not can be debated.
Do you seriously think that the reason I like the Common Core is for some self-interested reason? That's what you're saying.
No, I don't know that I believe that, and you
don't know. You don't know?
I don't think that I believe that. I don't. Okay, that's kind of a pertinent question.
This is giving money away. This is philanthropy. This is trying to make sure students have the kind of opportunity I had. There is nothing, and it's so almost outrageous to say otherwise in my view.
Okay.
I'm not here for that. But what is clear from his own speeches is that Gates is motivated by competition and market-based solutions.
And it will unleash a powerful market of people providing services for better teaching. For the first time, there'll be a large uniform base of customers looking at using products that can help every kid learn and every teacher get better.
He wanted teachers that achieved his definition of success to be rewarded, and those that didn't adhere to Gates standards should be retrained or sacked. In the end, the United States government and state and local educational bodies ended up spending trillions of taxpayers' money on an education reform that didn't work. All because one billionaire was able to staff a presidential administration and state educational institutions with his loyal lieutenants, and because one billionaire was able to bankroll research, development, political lobbying, and media coverage favorable to his little pet project. And once again, as soon as the results didn't meet the billionaire's expectations, Bill Gates abandoned the project and moved on to something else.
No more Common Core! Stop Common Core! Stop Common Core!
While the discourse in US education was falling apart under the weight of Common Core, Bill Gates was busy managing another one of his reforms. Over the years, Gates grew irritated with the way teachers were paid for their work. First, he complained about increased pay for teachers with master's degrees, because in his research, he didn't find enough evidence that would improve student achievement. He then complained about rewarding teachers for seniority, because again, he thought that had no effect on student achievement, according to his merits, right? Then he complained about teachers who, quote, can't do the job, and he suggested they should find another one. Yikes. Gates' answer to this problem was to introduce competition among teachers. Make teachers chase higher pay or risk getting booted. So with his billionaire charity, Gates created and funded a new teacher evaluation system that was meant to use standardized test scores to assess teaching performance. The thinking was that to give the poor access to quality education, the system would select the most effective teachers and then transfer them to low-income and high-need schools. Gates Foundation flooded the teacher evaluation project with $215 million. They partnered with 7 schools who funded the rest, and the total budget of the program was $575 million. So what did this project achieve 6 years and $500 million later? It flopped. The idea of using student test scores to assess teachers was flawed from the get-go. Assessment experts were warning about this. They said that standardized tests were only designed to evaluate student performance. They weren't designed to measure teacher performance, and they said there was no valid statistics to back up such methodology. But Gates didn't listen. Then unions thought it was unfair to rate teachers based on how well their students did. Gates didn't listen. But there was another problem. What about the whole thing of transferring teachers with high rating to low-income schools? Well, that didn't work as expected at all. High-need and low-income schools are also correlated with poorer student scores. So when the teachers who were ranked high according to their student scores were transferred into schools with lower scoring students, their rating would suffer as well, and teachers would be reluctant to stay in those schools or go to them in the first place. So instead of eliminating the educational gap between the high-income and low-income schools, the gap grew even wider. Low-income and high-need schools got newer and less experienced teachers, while high-income and already well-performing schools got the best teachers. In 2015, a 500-page long report by Rand Corporation concluded the project failed to reach any of its own objectives. No participating school improved student achievement or graduation rates, and they couldn't measurably lower dropout rates either. Costs quickly skyrocketed beyond local budgets, and the rewarding mechanism became unsustainable. Higher rewards failed to motivate teachers to stay teaching for longer. The project only succeeded in making lower-rated teachers leave sooner. When the costs inflated and the results only proved failure, one by one, schools began ditching this teacher evaluation in favor of non-judgmental colleague feedback. Only then did Bill Gates admit the whole project was a fiasco. You would think, after 15 years of implosions, private billions wasted, and trillions of public funds burned, Bill Gates would have learned his lesson and accept that maybe, just maybe, philanthropists shouldn't be setting public school agendas. But you'd be wrong, because Bill Gates is far from being done. According to the former cutthroat CEO, it was time to spend even more money, time, and public resources. This time, the focus will be on the curriculum. See, Bill Gates is not very good at introspection. So when the Common Core failed to bring consistent results, the blame was, of course, on the teachers not using a more effective curriculum. And once again, Gates promised to have an answer to the problem that he created. First, we need to use the data that we collected on unwitting students and teachers to identify high-quality teaching materials. The foundation will finance a rating system that will select the most effective materials. The lobbying arm of the charity will then push decision-makers to adopting these materials. And finally, Gates will fund organizations that will provide teacher training to make sure the new curriculum is followed with fidelity. Implemented with fidelity became the hot new buzzword, and teachers hated it with passion. You see, Bill Gates didn't trust teachers to do their job. In his view, they were either underpaid, overpaid, couldn't be trusted to follow guidelines, or shouldn't be teachers at all. When he was crafting his new reform, he rarely, if ever, asked teachers what they wanted or gave them the freedom to decide on their own. Instead, he pulled on his levers to get what he wanted with as little friction as possible. The new curriculum project cost the Gates Foundation $1.7 billion over 5 years. Most of the money went to development of new materials and supporting schools that adopted them. Implementation was then accompanied by data mining and analysis because Gates believes in only that success which can be measured on a graph. Now, what remains unanswered is one question. Why? Why is Bill Gates so heavily invested in changing education? He tried it several times and never succeeded. Why can't he let the teachers in schools make the decision based on the relationships they've built with students and parents? We could speculate about his true motives and self-interest, but I think the answer is in the clear. If you listen to Bill Gates himself, he'll tell you that education is a focal point of his philanthropy because of inequality. He tells us that by making quality education more accessible, there would be less poverty and less inequality in the world. Education is the solution to poverty. That could be true, but another thing is also true. As much as Bill Gates talks about inequality and poverty, he currently is one of the biggest causes of it. Gates built his billionaire empire off of Microsoft, but his philanthropic and investment ventures beyond that involve profiting off of the overexploited countries in the global south. Investments in big pharma, big agro, GMOs, and energy companies bring in billions in profits every year. Bill Gates is not fixing inequality, he is participating in it. So when Gates spends his billions to change an education policy, it doesn't matter if it fails or succeeds. What matters is that that becomes what we are all talking about. Gates wants the public to look at solving problems through his lens, that is, through seeking market-based solutions that can have a profitable business model. If one market-based approach doesn't work, we should be looking for another one. But we shouldn't stray away from that narrow profit-seeking perspective. By talking about education reform as a solution to inequality, we're not talking about Bill Gates as a source of that inequality. We're wasting trillions on reforms that don't work instead of taxing the billionaires on their excessive wealth and giving it to teachers in schools that need it the most and know what to do with it. So when you hear a story about how Bill Gates is spending $1 billion to improve math teaching, he isn't spending $1 billion to improve math teaching. He is spending $1 billion to make the Congress, the Department of Education, and local authorities pour trillions into another one of his pet projects, so that we don't talk about how many calories there are in an average billionaire. Education is for children and adults who want to pursue knowledge and skills. It isn't for billionaires to raise obedient servants. Thank you so much for watching this essay. I did this whole video by myself, including research, scripting, and all the editing you just saw. I take no sponsors because I believe in the true independence of journalistic and educational content. If you like the fact that my content is not tainted by sponsor interest, please donate to my Patreon. Thank you.